Hello to all of our listeners. My name is Tope, and today is another great day to be a social worker. Welcome to Social Work Amplified, a podcast hosted by Speak. Speak stands for Social Policy, Education, Advocacy, and Knowledge. And our mission is to amplify the voices of social workers by providing resources, increasing students' political engagement, and facilitating networking opportunities. Speak would like to gratefully acknowledge the generous support of the Simmons Sisters Fund at Texas Women's Foundation. I would like to introduce our guest for today's podcast, Alán Michael de León. Alán Michael de León is a first-generation Mexican-American from Houston, Texas. As the Houston Advocacy Organizer for MOVE Texas, Alán develops and executes issue-based campaigns in the Harris County region, which center historically underrepresented community, especially youth and people of color. Before becoming an organizer, Alán was also an educator for homeless and migrant youth in the Southeast Houston area. Alán has earned a master's in public affairs from Brown University, as well as a bachelor's degree with honors in philosophy and politics from the New School. He is fluent in Spanish, proficient in Portuguese, and in his spare time loves to salsa dance, play basketball, and travel. Hello, Alán. How are you today?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yes, we are so excited to have you here. So Alán is our first person that's not a social worker, but he is working in advocacy. So can you tell us a little bit about your position at MOVE?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for those who may not be familiar, so MOVE Texas is a statewide grassroots organization that works with communities across the state, namely youth communities and communities of color and other represented communities, really to build progressive movements and power in the state. I think that when you look at a lot of the big issues of our day, such as climate justice or criminal legal reform or voting rights, a lot of these movements are youth-led movements. And so in our case, right, what we try to do is work with young people on building capacity, right, to being able to make differences over these issues in their communities, in their cities, in their regions. In my particular case, a lot of what I do is that I'm responsible for building and executing our issue-based campaigns in the Houston-Harris County region, campaigns that seek to make policy changes or progress in general over the issue areas, right, that we prioritize. And in our case too, we have organizers all across the state. I'm the Houston-based organizer, but we have organizers in Dallas, we have organizers in San Antonio, Austin, Corpus Christi, Fort Worth, Laredo, and we're constantly growing every single year because movements in the state are growing every year, and there's just like an ever-growing hunger, right, for change in our state and across the country too, right? And so, that's just a little bit of what I do and what my organization is about.
Awesome. So can you tell us what MOVE, M-O-V-E, what does that acronym stand for?
It stands for Mobilize, Outreach, Vote, and Engage, right? And so a lot of what we try to do is really get that message across. A lot of what we do is not just like advocacy work, but field work as well. We have a big field department with a lot of field canvassers. A lot of what that work's about is really like voter registration. When election seasons come, it's also about getting out the vote. We're a nonpartisan organization, so we don't endorse candidates. So it's really just about trying to maximize participation, right, in our civic processes in the state and locally. And so when we're talking about the MOVE mission, right, it's really not just about encouraging people to vote, but of creating like a culture of voting, right, a culture of civic engagement, a culture of civic advocacy, creating lifelong voters, right, lifelong advocates, especially amongst young people, right, who are oftentimes looking to make a difference. And so creating that type of culture in our state is really what we do, and partly why we're also, where the name comes from.
Awesome. MOVE. So you are, like I mentioned earlier, our first interviewee that is not a social worker, but you did obtain your degree in public affairs, I believe, or as a public advisor.
Yeah, so I got my master's from Brown University in 2020. It was a master's in public affairs. So really what that training was about was a public policy training.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you don't have to get a public policy degree or any type of degree really to be an organizer. Mm-hmm. But in my particular case, right, like I was driven, part of the reason why I went to grad school is because growing up, like I definitely saw that, you know, in our state, there was a lot of under organization, right? Like I think that for the most part, like we live in a big state and there's a lot of communities that are oftentimes underrepresented in our political processes and in policymaking. And so, or bringing communities together, right? And how to organize communities to building power. It was important to understand. But for me, it was also important to understand like the policymaking processes, the ways in which differences can be made through our public institutions. And I think that was like some of the guiding questions that brought me into graduate school. I graduated in May in 2020, right around the time that the pandemic was starting, right? And so it was around that same time too, in the spring of 2020, when I was looking for to get into organizing, specifically in Houston, specifically in Texas. And it was around that same time when MOVE Texas was looking for a Houston advocacy organizer. So it was like the right moment, right?
Yeah.
Into working here.
It's the right opportunity at the right time. So, you know, your degree, your master's degree, it gave you valuable information and prepared you for your position. But as you were saying, one does not necessarily have to have your certain degree. So for our students that are listening, like anybody can be an organizer with MOVE.
Absolutely. And not even just with MOVE, but like in general, right? Because like what an organizer does, you know, what does it mean to be an organizer? What an organizer does more, you know, at its most essential level is create communities. Like that's what organizers do, right? Like a lot of our work when it comes to like advocacy on like policies, it's like, do sometimes we engage with public officials? Yes, we do. But you don't need a policy degree to engage public officials. And in fact, if that was the only thing that we were doing, then we would just be lobbyists, which we're not. You know, what we do is we organize, we create communities, in particular communities of people that want to be more politically and civically engaged and involved, especially amongst communities that weren't involved or civically engaged before, right? Creating power in places that there wasn't power before. And for me, like, you don't need a degree to create communities, right? Of people that want to see change in their, you know, in their region or in their city or in their locality. Some of the best organizers I know, in fact, never went to college or never got a bachelor's degree. I think that part of the reason why an organizer can come from almost any type of background is because there's just different roles to play, you know, for everybody. You know, there is a role for like people that have a policy expertise, but there's also a role for people, you know, as you mentioned, you know, we're talking about social workers. Even a person with a social worker's background has a role in organizing, and some of the best advocates that I know have a social worker background. A lot of my best partners, in fact, come from the University of Houston School of Social Work. And a lot of the best organizers that I know too, again, they didn't go to college, and that's okay. You know, everybody brings different value, and I think that what makes anybody successful is just a passion for the issues and a passion to want to make change. And I think that is the number one, I think, qualification, right, for wanting to get in movement building.
Awesome. Passion is what makes you successful as an advocacy organizer. So can you tell us a little bit about MOVE and how the organization came about?
Yeah, so our organization it started in 2015. At the time, it was really a student chapter at the University of Texas, San Antonio. Basically, a group of students at the time on campus got together because they observed that people were turning out for like big presidential elections, but we're not turning out for like other like kinds of elections, you know, elections for, you know, city council, elections for county commissioners, elections for school board, elections for state senate and state reps, right? And so there was a lot of like always excitement for presidential elections, but a lot of other key races were being taken for granted. And so what students at the time in 2015 at UTSA tried to do was to, they created a club on campus, which at the time was called Move San Antonio. Mm-hmm. And the goal was really to really encourage people to vote in local elections and in state elections, beginning by doing that on campus, trying to get students on campus to participate in local elections. And since then, we have obviously scaled. We're not Move San Antonio anymore. We moved Texas. We're organizers all across the state, and really building like on that initial mission, right? Like we want to see more civic engagement in our state. We want to see more inclusion in our political processes of our communities. And so, but that is how we started back in 2015.
That is such an awesome story. So back in 2015, MOVE started in San Antonio, Texas, and right now it's like expanding all throughout the state just in a matter of 6 years. So that just goes to show that there was like a need for such an organization, and like moved, like the students at UTSA, they stepped up and they met that need, and now it's expanding all over the state. Awesome.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, at the time it was just like a student club. I mean, at this point now, like the growth has really been exponential. Like between 2015 and when I started in 2020, you go from being like a student chapter to being like a full-fledged nonprofit with 25 full-time staff members. That was when I started. At this point now, we're approaching the end of 2021, and I'm about to complete like 2 years organizing MOVE Texas, and we're approaching 40 full-time staff members. By the end of next year, we might be reaching 50. But it's not just, again, like MOVE that's growing. It's really the movements in Texas, like progressive movements in Texas, which are growing. Even in my own time organizing in Houston, I've seen the ways in which the climate movement in Houston has exponentially grown. I've seen the ways in which criminal justice advocates have really come together and have built like big coalitions advocating for criminal legal reforms, policing reform, and racial justice. I've seen the ways in which across the state, communities have come together to defend voting rights, as we saw like this past year during the Texas legislative sessions, right? And so I think that movements and like just the general like the public demand for change and for like improving quality of life in our communities has really grown, and we're just like a small part of it. But it's certainly like endearing to see, and like already we totally expect to see continued growth in the years ahead.
Awesome. So I know you mentioned earlier that it's either you mentioned it or I read about it, that MOVE targets young people or the younger generation. And why is that? Why do they target the younger generation?
I think that part of the reason why we work with students in particular and youth in particular is because, one, it is young people in the state that are the most passionate about seeking and fighting for change, right? Mm-hmm. When it came, for example, to the massive national protests that emerged from 2020 after the killing of George Floyd, a lot of like the movements that emerged from that moment in our history, a lot of those protests were youth-led. A lot of those movements were youth-led, not even just as it pertains to like racial justice, but a lot of the movements as we're seeing in the area of climate justice are youth-led as well. Some of the strongest advocates in Houston, for example, which is like the infamously the energy capital of the world, right? Like one of the largest centers of petrochemical refineries and energy. It also happens to be the home to some of some of the strongest climate justice advocates with the Sunrise Movement, Houston Youth Climate Strike. All of these groups are youth-led groups that are really leading the charge, right, for a more renewable, greener future in Houston and across the country. And so that's partly why we work with young people, right? Because young people are already seeking to make a difference. They're already advocating for issues. And what we try to do is build capacity amongst young people, right, to equip them with knowledge and skills that they need in order to be effective as leaders and advocates. We do that in a variety of different ways. One of the ways in which we do that, for example, is simply like, oftentimes doing a lot of educational work over like the policymaking process, ways in which, localities can make a difference over regulations over energy, or be able to deal with police brutality as it pertains to racial justice. Like a lot of the stuff that we do is really connecting young people to opportunities to make a difference. And we can have a much longer conversation about that.
Yeah. Young people, they're the ones that are like, they're ready to see change. So that's why you guys target them.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to talk a little bit. Oh, sorry. What were you saying?
Oh, nothing.
Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about what you do personally as an advocacy organizer. What does your day-to-day life look like? Can you just give us like a brief synopsis?
Yeah, so in my day-to-day, like a lot of what I do is a lot of my work is based around relationship building, right? When we're talking about organizers and what they do, when we talk about building communities, that means that you're really like spending a lot of time talking with people. Mm-hmm. We're, not only with young people, the people that we work with, but also with partners, right? Other people, other groups in the movement, for whether it's climate justice or racial justice or voting rights, building coalitions, right? Like part of what it means to create change in the state is not just to build capacity amongst communities, but also make partnerships. To really grow the movement, you need to like really work together with other groups, other communities that have like shared interests. And a lot of my day-to-day, for example, then is I'm having like meetings with partners. This morning, in fact, I had a meeting with the ACLU of Texas, members from their team, in order to really discuss some of like our collective goals over what types of criminal legal campaigns we want to have in the state, what type of like goals we should have as it pertains to racial justice in 2022, because it's going to be a big year, it's an election year, and there's going to be like just a lot of interest as it pertains to politics and civic engagement. And so a lot of my day-to-day looks like that, right? Like having those type of conversations with partners, having those type of conversations and coalitions with other allied groups, and then going back to, the groups that we work with, right? Like the young people that we work with, the students that we work with, and connecting them to those advocacy opportunities, kind of creating that capacity, right? So that, say, if we were to launch like a big campaign that involves rallies, that involves like making demands out of public officials, which means testifying at a city council meeting or at a county commissioner's court meeting or anything like that, like, really like preparing and equipping young people with the skills and knowledge that they need in order to be able to become effective advocates in these campaigns alongside our partners. And so a lot of my day-to-day is really that, having conversations with partners, working with young people, doing a lot of education, and mainly in my case, right, in Houston, but colleagues doing, the organizers in Dallas, organizers in San Antonio, organizers in Laredo, and so on and so forth, doing the same thing.
Awesome. So it seems like your day is pretty busy. Like each and every day is pretty busy because you're building relationships, you're educating, you're just doing so much. So I know you, I read a little bit about MOVE, how MOVE is just doing a lot of things. And I know you mentioned to me that one of the success stories of MOVE was bringing about a polling station into a jail. So can you tell us a little bit about that? What brought that about, and how were you guys able to bring that about?
Yeah, so when we're talking about very specific issue-based campaigns, so one of those campaigns in this case is a very important one because it's at the intersection of voting rights, it's at the intersection of criminal legal reform, it's at the intersection of racial justice. And that is the campaign to bring polling locations inside jails. The reason being is because we first have to understand that in the state of Texas, the jail population is 150,000. There's 150,000 currently this year in jails. And in Harris County in particular, in the Harris County jail alone, we're talking 9,000 people there in just one jail. Now, the issue, we're talking about mass incarceration, right? But I think that when we're talking about this issue, we have to understand mass incarceration as not just like a criminal justice issue, but as a voting rights issue. Because when you incarcerate residents, you are effectively disenfranchising them from our voting and electoral processes. The reason is because when you're in jail, there's not a reliable means for people to be able to vote. And this is a very serious issue because the Supreme Court has weighed in the 1970s that everybody that's in jail over a misdemeanor charge, like a traffic violation or a petty drug crime or whatever, anybody that's been in jail but hasn't been convicted of a crime, or in other words, a pretrial detainee, basically everybody who's in jail that's not there for a felony offense, they maintain their right to vote. Mm-hmm. This is what the Supreme Court ruled in the 1970s. However, they maintain their right to vote, but they don't actually have reliable means of being able to exercise their right to vote. Mm-hmm. Because when you're in jail, you can't go out and to a polling location and vote. Oftentimes, what people try to do in certain jail facilities is to provide incarcerated residents with mail ballots. But the problem is that a lot of jail facilities simply don't do it. And even if they do it, because there's no mandate to provide those ballots. And even when they do it, you run into this problem where there's deadlines for you to be able to request a mail-in ballot. And so if you're booked or you're incarcerated after that deadline, then you don't have a means of being able to even vote by mail. So the most reliable way is to refranchise people that have been disenfranchised from our voting processes through mass incarceration is by bringing voting machines directly into carceral facilities. And what we try to do is to try to get that done here in Harris County. So this has been a campaign that's been really in the works over many, many, many years. And this past November, we had special elections, 2 weeks ago, where we were voting for school board vacancies, and we're voting for constitutional amendment propositions in the state of Texas. And during this election, after many years worth of advocacy, there was a polling location inside the Harris County Jail. And it was the first polling location of its kind in this, not even in Texas, but in the South. There was only 3 other places in the country that had done something similar. That was Chicago, DC, and LA. And so this was the 4th polling location of its kind, which attempted to refranchise incarcerated residents. And I think that's important because in the broader scheme of things, when we're talking about progressive change, it's hard to really fight for that, right? Whenever you have hundreds of thousands of people who maintain their right to vote but are unable to do so simply because of a lack of political will, of not providing the infrastructure, right, for people to participate in the processes. In this case, right, by bringing voting machines in the jail. And to give you a specific number, in the Harris County Jail specifically, pretrial detainees alone make up 86% of all the people that are in the jail. These are 86% of the people in the jail haven't been convicted of any crime. So per the law, they are eligible to vote. But again, it's always been a matter of providing the means, right, for them to be able to do so. And in Harris County, at least, we've started to change that. And already we're hearing from other counties, right, of organizers in Fort Bend County, organizers in Bexar County, just where San Antonio is, wanting to do the same thing. And so this is, the ripple effect, the domino effect of the progress that we're making here. It's also been very, a positive aspect, right, of the campaign that we launched here.
Awesome. I just think that's such an awesome success story because, most people think that once somebody's in jail, they lose their right to vote, but that's really not the case. But technically, or kind of, they were losing that right because the means to vote wasn't provided for them. But right now it's being restored slowly but surely. And I really do hope it does have a domino effect because I just think that's such an awesome success story. And I think you told me that you actually went there to, cast your vote for the November elections.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So obviously, when the November election happened on election day, I went to the Harris County Jail myself, in downtown Houston. to kind of experience it. You know, in Harris County, you know, the Harris County Jail is this big brown facility, and it has a lot of windows. A lot of the windows are actually fake; they're not even real. You know, a lot of people in the jail are like, they don't have access to like sunlight or like clean air, like right, like you know. So when you're approaching the place, you already feel like this is a very atypical type of polling location, and just like, you know, you start to really like feel like, you know, the presence of like carceral infrastructure and like the issues of it. And when you walk in, right, when I walked in to vote, there's police walking in and out of this place, right, obviously, and I, you know, I've never been in a, you know, in an environment like that to vote, and so for me, like, I walk into the lobby of the jail, and you know, for this polling location, you know, the thing to understand is that the election code mandates that every polling location has to be accessible to every voter, right? So if you're going to have a polling location in the jail, you have to make it so that people in and out of the jail both have access to it. So the way that they made this polling location work is that they had a secure area and a non-secure area. The secure area of the polling location was where only people who were incarcerated could go and be able to cast a ballot. And then there was the non-secure area, which is basically the lobby of the jail, where when I walk in through the front doors, to my right, there was like a hallway where there was a couple of voting machines, and that's basically where I casted my ballot.
Awesome.
So it was
how did that experience feel for you? Like, just actually participating in voting at a jail?
Well, in my particular case, like, you know, I was happy to cast the ballot, but like what I was most happy about is knowing that there was people casting a ballot in that facility that otherwise wouldn't have been casting a ballot before, were not for that polling location, were not for all of the work that went into bringing a polling location into that facility, right? Like, it made the entire like effort very, very real, and it put into perspective that, you know, this is what we're doing here at this jail today is something that's not happening across the country, and it hasn't happened for a long, long time. I think people have always just taken for granted, you know, jailed populations, you know, taken for granted their right to vote, taken for granted their right to like a decent like livelihood. Like, again, like, a lot of the people in the jail don't even have access to sunlight or clean air. And so when we're talking about like policing reform, when we're talking about broader criminal legal reform, when we're talking about racial justice, it's only right that the people that are being directly impacted by these issues to be able to have a voice in our political and civic processes. And so for me, it was very, very like special and fulfilling to know that, and humbling to know that, you know, that we are doing and accomplishing the work of refranchising disenfranchised communities, and moving away, right, from like just always wanting to focus on excessive punishment, and really just trying to create a process that's fair. And I think this particular polling location was just like one of the very small, but one of the first steps in this regard to try to get this done.
I'm pretty sure that was very inspiring for you as an advocacy organizer. So now we're going to move on. We're going to garner some knowledge from you to our social work students and our future political advocates. So what are some of the ways that you choose to be politically engaged?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, in my case, right, so like, I'm basically politically engaged full time. But even like, so in my own spare time, like, I try to maintain like certainly like a balance, right? Like, I think that this work is certainly not easy.
Yeah.
And I think that what's important to understand about this work is that, you know, it's a very dangerous line of work. You know, a lot of people can oftentimes feel burnt out. You know, we've had a lot of advocates, a lot of social justice warriors throughout history, right, that died early in the fight for you know, social justice. And I think that one of the things that I've learned as an organizer is that it's important to really to stay alive, right? Like, I think to be able to not only begin a campaign or be a part of a movement from a very young age, but to like be able to see it through to the end. And so basically the point that I'm making is that, you know, one of the ways that I stay politically engaged is by like maintaining like a very maintaining like a work-life balance, right? Being able to like know when to engage, but also know when to rest. And I think a lot of people who become organizers, who get involved in politics, like that's something that people need to be periodically reminded of. That, you know, in order to really accomplish a lot of our goals, you need to think about like how we can be involved in the long term. And so for me, like when I'm politically engaged, like the way that I do it is by, you know, having conversations with people, doing a lot of education, doing a lot of relationship building, doing a lot of like campaign building, holding elected officials accountable, but then also resting, right? Because this is a line of work that really requires that, you know, and trying to learn, right, from like history, right, and the importance of being able to maintain a movement over the long haul.
So one of the ways that you choose to remain politically engaged is to recharge and rest. I really like that, because I think some of us, we think, especially as students, we think that in order to remain politically engaged, we have to do more. But like you said, burnout is a thing. When we do more, we're just going to burn out quicker and faster. But when we recharge, we rest, then we can do more effectively. Thank you so much for that.
Okay.
So what's the first step you think should be that every student should take to get started with political, social work, or advocacy? What are some of the first steps?
I think that one of the first steps that anybody that wants to make a difference is to really look into their own backyard and see what's happening there. Not, I mean, literally like in their own backyard, but I mean more of like in their city, right? Like, I think that people often get like overwhelmed by the scale of issues, especially when we're talking about an issue like racial justice, when we're talking about an issue of climate justice, voting rights, like a lot of the national like issues can really be overwhelming. But I think that people should like really like zoom in. It's like, you know, what's going on in your city? What's going on in your own community? What's going on in your own county? So somebody who wants to get involved in advocacy, somebody who wants to get involved like civically or politically, really start paying attention to what's happening in your city. You know, who are your city council members? Yeah. What are they weighing? You know, people should know that city councilors will meet every week, every other week. A lot of these meetings are public, and they're debating and making decisions, right, that impact the day-to-day lives of the residents of that locality. Same thing at the county level, same thing at the state level. Again, it goes back to this thing where, you know, when MOVE was founded, we observed that most people only really pay attention to what's happening at the state level, I'm sorry, at the federal level with the president and stuff like that. But really, the decisions that impact most people's day-to-day lives are being made at a local level, at the city level, at the state level, at the county level. And so really starting to pay attention, right? Starting to pay attention to who are your local and state elected officials, what are the issues that they're weighing in on. And then from there, once you become familiar with the local politics or the local state of affairs in your community, then you'll be able to see what are the ways that somebody can get involved, what are the prominent issues of your locality, and what are the needs, right? What are the communities that are not being advocated for? What are the communities that are being underrepresented? What are the policies or what are like the local initiatives that are not being created? And, you know, so all these things, right, begin by first, you know, really zooming in locally, understanding what are the local dynamics, and then from there, I think that's always the best way to be able to start like becoming an advocate for issues, because that's also like the most practical way. We're here in just, you know, in specific communities. We can't be everywhere all the time. So really, there's always a need from your own locality, right, for your own involvement. And so definitely starting local is the best way.
That is true. So we don't have to go really far to take that first step. The first step can be in our own backyard, like you said, like
start local.
In our city, within our counties. It could be as close to us as we want it to be. Thank you. So how long did it take you to get to where you are today with political advocacy? Like, what are some of your background experiences or like, can you tell us a little bit about your journey to get where you are today?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, like, the journey really began from childhood. I'm the first in my family to be born in the United States. Both of my parents are immigrants from Mexico. And we come really from a low-income background, right? Like, both my grandparents, my grandfathers were taxi drivers in Mexico. My grandmothers didn't work. And when my parents got here, my mom worked in like banquet catering. My dad worked in like the service industry. So, coming from a mixed status family too, right? Like, I was the first in my family to be born in the United States, but I also had a lot of family members and have a lot of family members to this day that didn't have documentation. And so, living like a life that was extremely like politicized, right? Like, knowing that some of us had like protections and security that comes with citizenship, and knowing that other members of my family didn't, was really, really impactful and very formative for me. Seeing even members of my own family which have been deported were very like impactful events that made me to question, right? Like, why is this happening? What is it that we can do to prevent like these like separations, family separations from happening? And that led me down like a course of like immigrant rights, and from there, then seeing how hard my mom worked, and seeing like my family how hard they worked, but then still like struggling, right, to like be able to meet like basic economic like obligations, right, like being able to pay bills and stuff like that. Wondering, right, is hard work really like the pathway to like economic mobility? Because my parents worked very hard, but we weren't really feeling that, and so for me, like, all of these things, right, like it really, my journey into like civic engagement began in childhood, and just asking questions about like my really like the the state of affairs in my family and in my own community, right? And then from there, like, I go to college and I major in politics and I major in philosophy, right? And when I graduated, one of the first jobs that I took up was working as an educator for migrant and homeless youth in the same school district from which I graduated from. And so, for me, like, I knew by the time I graduated college that I wanted to make a difference in my community. And I did that as an educator, working right with people who, young people, students that were in unstable housing, working with migrant students, people who had just entered the country, oftentimes didn't know how to speak English, right, and providing that special, attention and providing that extra support so that they could have been academically successful. Like, that was a very fulfilling work that I was doing right out of college.
Yeah.
But what I immediately noticed was that there was a lot of other issues in the school district too that I started to pay attention to, right? Like, I started seeing the ways in which teachers were underpaid. I started seeing the ways in which schools were under-resourced. I started seeing the ways in which there wasn't a lot of people advocating for teachers, right? Like, I think that, and advocating for people who work in a school district, right? Like, people who drive buses and people who work in the cafeteria, janitors. Oftentimes, these people are paid like $10 an hour, which is not a living wage. And we're not talking about like young people working these jobs. We're talking about heads of households, right? And so all of these things made me realize that, this is very fulfilling work, but there has to be a bigger impact. There has to be like greater reform at a higher level. There has to be like advocacy, right, for the people working in education. And so that's what eventually led me to then go to grad school to pursue a public policy training, and then to come back and eventually become an organizer and start working on advocacy related issues, creating campaigns and executing campaigns, and doing fulfilling the need, right, that I observed in my community. So that's really a little bit of how I got into this work in a nutshell.
Yes, thank you for sharing your journey with us. Your journey doesn't seem easy, but it seemed like it really shaped you to do what you're doing now, and you're doing it effectively.
Thank you.
So, how do you manage information overload in a society that overloads us with so much information? What do you do to kind of manage that?
I think in my particular case, like, I think it's important to like specialize. Like, I think it's important to, I talked a little bit about rest earlier, right? So managing work-life balance is crucial, but like, when you're actually working, I think it's important to really zero in on specific issues, right? Because there's a lot, passively, I've talked about what are some of the issues that I've kind of like zeroed in on, just voting rights, climate justice, and racial justice. But there are so many other issues, right? That need attention and that need work, education, labor, reproductive rights, LGBTQ plus rights, housing justice. I mean, there are so many other issues, right? There are so many other ways in which we can improve quality of life in our communities, which to me, that's what it's all about. There's nothing that really kind of, I guess you could say, keeps me involved or keeps me motivated beyond just wanting to see improved quality of life in those communities. And I think that in my particular case, right, I've realized that everybody has a role to play. We all want to make a difference, work, as big of a difference all the time, but also being practical and just being just kind to yourself too, that look, it's not always about trying to do everything. It's really about knowing where you can make the biggest impact and knowing your role. And then for me, right, so in a world where there's so much information and there's so many different ways in which somebody can make a difference, I think really just identifying what are the things that you are most passionate about, what are the particular interests that you care about, and really zeroing in on that, and building an expertise and competence around that. I think that is one of the best ways, right, to be able to manage the overload, really, setting priorities and then going from there.
That's true. I believe that is really helpful, zeroing in on those things that you are passionate about. Because when you're passionate about something, you're able to kind of pursue it more effectively. You can give your the best of your energy, at least, to that one thing. Not that, the other things aren't important, but, if you are passionate about something, you can zero in on it and then focus on it and then do it effectively. You don't have to deal with that overload that people tend to experience and end up burning out because they're trying to do all the things all at once. Thank you for that advice. So what's the #1 website that can help students with advocacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think in that particular case, it really depends. This goes back to what we were just talking about, right? If people want to, know where to go to a specific website as it pertains to advocacy, well, it really depends on what specific issue. Because, again, if somebody wanted to get involved in climate justice, for example, and if they were a young person specifically, if they were a student specifically, if you want to get involved in climate justice advocacy in the country, one of the best groups doing that is the Sunrise Movement. And so go into the Sunrise Movement, which also comes with they do a lot of great work as it pertains to producing educational materials, right, over where we are as a country, as it pertains to climate justice, and where even information down to a local level, right, being able to learn how does the climate question impact your locality.
Mm-hmm.
That is one of the ways, right, in which you can point people to, right. It's very issue specific. As it pertains to voting rights, as it pertains to criminal legal reform, as it pertains to climate justice. If you're in Texas, then you can certainly visit MOVE Texas's website. But there's so many other groups doing this work too. On the voting rights front, Texas Civil Rights Project is a big partner. The ACLU of Texas is a big partner. Texas Freedom Network is a big partner. And these are all Texas-specific groups. And so if you're in a different state, there's different groups doing similar work. And so this is why, this goes back to if you want to get involved in advocacy and you want to know where to go, the best place to start is to just start locally. What type of, what's going on in your city, what's going on in your state, what are you personally passionate about, right? Creating your own priorities for what it is that you want to do, and then going from there. And so that's basically the best advice that I can give. If you can identify what are your priorities, and if you really start to pay attention to what's happening in your own locality, the advocacy opportunities will present themselves and you'll be able to find them.
Awesome. So in your opinion, there's no #1 website, but an individual should find that website that aligns with the thing that they're passionate about. And there's so many organizations like you mentioned.
Yeah, exactly, right. I mean, because again, it goes back to just finding your own role in this, right? It's kind of like you mentioned, when you create a priority over one thing over another, it's not that something's not important. It's more of like everybody has a role to play. Everything is equally important, and it's just, being able to do the work, right? Or being able to identify what is that I'm passionate about and what type of work do I want to get involved in. From there, like, you'll be able to find, where it's your best fit.
Awesome. Everyone has a role to play. Everyone is equally important. Thank you, Alán, for spending time with me today. Thank you to all of our listeners for joining us for another episode of Social Work Amplified. I hope you were able to learn something today that empowers you to be more politically engaged and help you shape a better tomorrow. Until next time.